In team sports, go back and look at our game at the weekend or look at any sport, there is chaos. It is based on chaos. If you are out of position, if you are in a place where you should not be, what do you have to do, regardless of that, to help contribute to winning the game? At the end of the day, it's about winning the game. That has to be front and foremost. It's not about you. It's not about your own personal goals. It's about winning the game or the commander's intent.
Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the Breaking Muscle podcast, where we sit down with thought leaders who are changing their fields at the highest levels in sports. I am Pete Hitzeman, your host today and managing editor at BreakingMuscle.com, and joining me as co-host is our youth development specialist, Shane Trotter. Turn on the TV or the radio right now and call up your favorite sports station. I guarantee that within minutes, you'll hear someone spouting off a list of statistics about a team or player that's meant to provide some sort of insight into their value or why they won or lost last weekend. But Dr. Fergus Connolly, performance director for the University of Michigan football program, is here to tell you why our obsession with the numbers game is entirely misplaced. Dr. Connolly's new book, Game Changer, is an encyclopedic repudiation of the big data approach to team sports. In it, he presents a set of sophisticated and fascinating models for evaluating the game, developing the player, preparing the team, and leading as a coach. Dr. Connolly has a unique gift for finding the essential commonalities in all team sports, and using those fundamental truths to create a system by which coaching staffs can extract maximum performance from their teams on game day. Borrowing from fields as diverse as chaos theory, psychology, high-level mathematics, anatomy and physiology, Middle Eastern philosophy, sociology, and more, Game Changer represents a turning point in how coaches, athletes, and even fans should understand their sport. We dive deep into the foundation of his approach, why it's better for players and everyone else involved, why he believes that periodization is dead, and the changes he'd like to see in team sports moving forward. If you coach, play, or even like to watch from home, this is one interview and book that are essential to your experience. If you like what we're doing with the podcast so far, be sure to head over to iTunes or Stitcher and leave us a rating and a review, as that will help us get the word out about the show. If you have any comments or feedback, including who you'd like to hear from as a future guest, shoot us an email at editorial@breakingmuscle.com. Joining us this morning from campus in Ann Arbor, Michigan, is Dr. Fergus Connolly. He's the performance director for Michigan football and has a string of very fun job titles: director of elite performance for the 49ers, sports science director for I think the Welsh rugby team, and he holds a PhD in computer integration-based optimization, which is not something you would normally associate with a football program, but we're here to find out how he knows all the things that he knows. Dr. Connolly, thank you for making the time this morning.
No, thank you for having me.
So you've given us a book. It's called Game Changer, and I can't think of a book I've read recently that was more aptly titled, because diving into it for the last week or so, Shane and I both have been kind of set on our heels about all the things that we previously misunderstood about team sports. The subtitle is The Art of Sports Science, kind of a riff on Sun Tzu's Art of War, and I think that's appropriate as well. How did you get into writing a book about team sports theory?
I think the honest answer is that I wanted to write the book that I would have wanted to read coming into the sport, coming into the industry. I think those of us who work in team sport, have been involved in team sports, maybe coaching kids, coaching even our local soccer team or whatever, are always looking for answers. We're always trying to find what the magic formula is. If you bump into the local strength coach at the gym, he tells you that it's all about strength training. You meet an athletics coach, he tells you no, it's speed, it's speed training. You bump into the chiropractor and he'll tell you, well, no, it's flexibility, and go down to your local GNC, it's all about supplements. So I went through that same experience coming through my career, maybe on a different level, speaking to strength coaches, physiologists, etc. But there was never one resource for me as working in team sports. There was never one good book that I could read that would pull everything together. So that's really, I wrote the book that I would have wanted to read when I was coming through, and to try and pull all of those areas together into one book. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that this is the final Bible. I don't think that this is completely comprehensive. It can't be. There's no way that it can be. But it covers every single area and pulls it together in a model, to try and help coaches, give them a starting point.
Yeah, and I think you've succeeded in that. And what I was impressed with going through the book is that as broad as the areas are that you cover, you don't sacrifice depth. What you've come out with is sort of a postgraduate course in team sports development and game dynamics and human development. It's really deep stuff, and we'll kind of get into the details on that. So let's take a step back. How do you end up from Ireland, now in Michigan, working with a football team, and the wrong kind of football? What's your background there?
Yeah, somebody asked me, how did I end up working with a coach like Jim Harbaugh, who comes from essentially a football dynasty, an NFL, American football dynasty. How did I end up? And I think both our fathers are very similar in that it comes back to three things: hard work, a lot of hard work. That's why we're doing this at 6 a.m. There's a brutal honesty involved. He's pretty blunt. I'm pretty blunt. And believe it or not, there's a certain amount of humility. You every day are really critical of your own ability to perform. So I think that's how I ended up here. But really, I've always been trying to figure out how do team. I've worked in rugby, I've worked in soccer, I've worked in all of the team sports, major field sports, and when you move from sport to sport, you realize the principles are the same, and that's slowly something that I don't think anybody else has worked full time in all of those sports. So maybe I'm one of the first to identify the fact that in, for example, basketball, if you are trying to score, you have to create space. Same in college football, American football, soccer. You're trying to create space to allow somebody score. The principles of all of those sports are the same. The challenge is, can you adapt to the environment? So, for example, when I was at the 49ers, could can a skinny white guy from Ireland connect with and communicate with Patrick Willis or Navarro Bowman, get their trust, convince them that this is a better recovery approach than they've used before, etc., etc. I think that's what decides whether or not you can succeed in the business once you have the base knowledge. But anybody in in the sport or health industry sees that and knows that. You can know everything that you want, but can you communicate? That's the question. Can you communicate with your audience, your client? I think that's very often the difference.
And that's one of the points. I was just rereading a section you were talking about finding a common dialogue between all of the different disciplines that are involved in your team sport. Your athletic trainer is going to have a different use of the word speed than your strength and conditioning coach, than your head coach. Getting everybody to kind of unify on a lexicon is hugely important. So how did you come to look at team sports and find common systems, find those common elements, the creating of space, the movement to and from the ball, the transitions? What was the light bulb moment when you said, this is all exactly like?
Well, I would love to tell you that it was a wonderful, enlightening moment, but the truth is I got fired. I lost a job. I think I was with a soccer team, coaches change, I lost a job and ended up working in rugby, or vice versa, whichever it was. So you move from one sport to the other by accident initially, and then you start to realize, hang on a second, there are far more things in common between rugby and soccer than there are differently. And I realized that, in any industry starting out, it's good to be uncomfortable. If you're any young person in this, starting out in this industry, one piece of advice that I would have for them is do not specialize too young. Move. If you get the opportunity to move to a different industry, move to a different sport, as in my case, and learn, because being uncomfortable like that forces you to learn. But in my case, what I started to do was to identify and see the things that were most common. And I love what I do. I love what I do. I get up in the morning, I think I'm probably the only person who gets a speeding ticket on the way to work at 6 a.m. Trying to get in here to do this, but yeah, that's how it happened. It happened by accident. I started to realize that, and most people are perhaps the opposite. When they move from job to job, they're looking and they only see the differences. I embrace the differences. They're the challenge. But I was always trying to reuse what I'd used before, see the common principles, realize that at the end of the day, it's still a person I'm dealing with. I still have to get their trust. I still have to be honest with them, know that I actually care about them, come up with a model that they can understand quickly, and come up with a protocol that they can implement fast, and then continue to reinforce the improvement. So there are far more similarities between the sports than differences.
So you've really written 4 books. You've written a book about the game, you've written a book about the player, you've written a book about preparation, and then you've written a book about the coach. First, I wish you would have just written 4 books in a series, because I would have bought all 4. But I want to kind of walk through each of those areas.
Just on the idea of the 4 books, the reason that I wanted to and was very conscious about putting the four sections or 4 books together was that one of the biggest failings in say Western society or today is that we specialize far too early and far too much. So if you go to any backroom team of any support staff in any organization, we've got a specialist for absolutely everything at this stage. The backroom teams or the support staff of professional teams is so extensive, but you've got people for, you've got your psychologist, your nutritionist, your strength coach, your flexibility expert. You almost need a second bus just for the support staff and the experts, and there are very few resources or models that pull all of these things together into a simplified model that is usable for most people, and that's why the holistic answer, the holistic approach is most successful. And again, with tactical periodization or with the tactical model, what has happened today in professional sport is that we focus primarily on the physical aspects. So let's say you're at the Super Bowl, or let's say you're at any kind of great sporting occasion, and receiver catches a brilliant long pass and the crowd goes crazy. Well, the psychologist for the team is sitting there going, well, that was my work. I worked really hard with him on his concentration, and the flexibility experts going, did you see the angle that he got? Do you see his reach? Strength coaches going, well, no, that was really my, we worked really hard on power and plyometrics. The nutritionist is going, I got him so lean that he could get to, he could jump that high. And the position coach is going, well, really, we did a lot of work on handling in the warm-up, and it goes on and on. Now, when he fumbles the ball, psychologist goes, well, that was the position coach, didn't get him in the right position. So, but all joking aside, though, there are so many individual experts who all have valid input, but we know that for all of these things to come together, only a few years ago, one coach was doing all of these things. So how do we create a model that, whatever way it happens, the end result is a success, the end result is a win? And that's been a challenge for me over the years, to come up with a model, because in different sports, different people do it different ways. But at the end of the day, you see this most prominently in elite military units. At the end of the day, there's a result that you have to get. How do you get that result? And let's work backwards from that, as opposed to, sometimes in professional sport we have too much money, as opposed to getting all the experts in a room and trying to figure out what happens.
So the contributing influences on the models you've created in Game Changer are as broad as you can imagine. It's chaos theory, it's Middle Eastern mysticism and philosophy, it's high-level mathematics, anatomy and physiology, military tactics, psychology, sociology. There's something for everybody in this book. Something everybody's from every discipline is going to identify with and go, aha, that's where I contribute. But you've tied it all together into some really interesting ways of evaluating and improving team sports performance. And I wondered if we might take Michigan's game against Florida from this past weekend as kind of a walkthrough in your game model right? So this game was, I think, particularly illustrative because it didn't go anything like either team had planned, I would say, and because the box score and the stats tell nothing about how that game actually went. On paper, it looks like a very comfortable Michigan win over a strong Florida Gators team, but that just isn't how the actual game went down. Can you kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, sure. I would be delighted to take all the credit for Michigan's success. Heck no. No, like you mean, and again, that's a perfect example of where you have, we have some incredible coaches from the top down, who all have contributed to produce the end result. But to your point, nobody, expected it to go the way that we did. Nobody expected the chaos, for example, turnovers, interceptions. Nobody expected that. We certainly don't plan for it. And then you have, again, in the middle of that, you've got refereeing decisions, which are questionable from time to time. But again, coming back to what you spoke about, we have, for example, on defense, an excellent, a wonderful defensive coordinator in Don Brown, and when you watch how we play, one of the, and you'll identify it, there's no such thing as defense, it's just offense without the ball. It's cause the opponent to make decisions. And, I reference, for example, John Boyd quite a bit in the OODA loop. Can you force your opponent to think? Because really what we're trying to do in all sports is we're trying to play off instinct. The minute I ask you to think or force you to think, you've paused, and then it's game over. At the elite end, same in close quarter combat, same in small unit operations. If I can force you to think, pause, it's game over, because now you're essentially choking. It's a mini choke. That's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to develop players that can play off instinct. Another point that you referenced also is if you just take the scoreboard and take the actual statistics alone, they very rarely tell the whole story, because everything happens within a moment, and particularly the end result, the end statistics are very, very poor examples of how a game went. So everybody has to remain focused. There has to be a principle involved, as opposed to just a rule for you to do something. So yeah, the book I think helps us understand games and team sports better perhaps than what has gone before. I hope it does.
No, I think it certainly does. And one of the things that you referenced John Boyd's OODA loop, that's OODA. It's observe, orient, decide, and act. And that resonated with me after a 15-year military career. I was like, ooh, he's speaking my language. This is stuff that we studied.
Everybody in sport must study his work, and you can attest to this. You can study it on any level. There are a few people who, in modern times, have come up with innovative ideas, innovative concepts like he has. And the irony is that it was adopted more by the Marine Corps than it was the U.S. Air Force.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the interesting things, so there are systems within systems within systems that you talk about. So in Saturday's game, there was no rushing game at all from Florida. They just could not get anything going on the ground. And the ripple of that is that now the offensive line is worried about their blocking schemes. The running back is not confident when he takes the ball. The guys in the booth are going to have to call different plays because they know that their intended rushing attack won't work. Now their quarterback isn't confident. He got pulled. There's all kinds of, it ripples out and out and out. All of those subsystems break down because the rushing defense was so strong and the attack was so strong from the front four from Michigan. So that sort of systemic look at the game really contributes to the understanding of even a layman, and that's kind of what I wanted to get to. This is not a book. This is a book for people who love to watch team sports as much as it is for people who coach team sports, because it assigns a different level of understanding, even from those of us who spend our Saturdays on the couch screaming at the TV instead of on the sidelines in front of the screaming fans. One of the other claims that you made in the book that I think deserves a whole bunch of exploration: periodization is dead. And this'll be Shane's jam right here. we have a whole bunch of coaches, and we've encouraged them to spend a whole lot of time explaining to other coaches why they need to periodize their programs, dang it. And now periodization is dead. Can you kind of, Shane, take us through, what we've seen in the book, and let's talk about that.
Shane's still there after that comment?
We haven't driven him off yet.
Certainly, I'm reading that, and being a strength and conditioning coach, it's like, oh, really? You kind of pulled me back in with Charlie Francis, and I'm initially defensive in writing notes saying, well, what about this? Well, what about this? You certainly won me over by the end of the section. It's tactical programming, as you call it, which is going to balance 4 coactives rather than just making the physical aspect your backbone and kind of pulling everything behind that or alongside that. Tactical, tactics, team being the foundation. You then add, there's 4 coactives, the technical along with tactical, techno-tactical, they tend to go together, and then the psychological and the physical. And it's a balancing of the 4, but not just you have one physical segment, you have one psychological segment, you have one tactical segment, you have one technical. It's a very holistic, integrated approach that isn't, it kind of yins and yangs them all together, I would say, while also accounting for the recovery of the different body systems, and it's pretty. It quickly gives you an understanding of how challenging it must be to program for all these things, but it is a very fascinating look at team planning, which, as you already alluded to, stems from the game, working back from the game in what you call a morpho cycle, morph being the key word. So I'm just interested in hearing you clean that up a little bit, and then there's some specific questions about specific crazy things that can come up on the programming side that I'm sure would be interesting to hear your opinion on.
No, I think you did an excellent job of explaining where I'm coming from, and also the idea that periodization is dead really is that the traditional model and traditional use of the word periodization. Again, if we get caught up in just arguing about semantics and terms, we don't get anywhere. But the traditional idea of periodization, where we focus on strength for 6 weeks, power for 6 weeks, and speed for another 6 weeks, that traditional model adopted from the Olympic sports doesn't work well in team sports. I know there are coaches who do it, and they do. Some of them get good results, some of them do and don't. But I don't think it's the optimal approach anymore for team sports. There is a more efficient way to train team sport athletes. And of course, this goes back to the idea of, if you have silos in a team sport environment, if you have a strength coach who doesn't talk with the position coach or doesn't have a good relationship with the head coach, well then the strength coach is just going to periodize. But where this came from my perspective, was I would work with some incredibly talented athletes who are at the sport, and game after game after game we would sit down and critically analyze the performances, and we had guys who were physical studs in different sports but just weren't getting better tactically, weren't getting better skill-wise, were failing psychologically. So how do you train those components in the limited amount of time that you have? Because people forget that with travel, with all of the different, every single minute is incredibly valuable. So can I train you to be more tactically aware? Can I train you to develop your skill level and at the same time continue to maintain or improve your physical qualities? And that's what the aim of this program is. Identify what your limiting factor is, whether it's skill or tactics, and design a game, design a drill, design something that allows you work on those while still developing speed, strength. How do I do that? Because if I can do that, I increase your recovery time, which means that you're always going to be, so you're going to get better, but you're going to be fresher when you have to perform at the weekend. So the traditional model of periodization doesn't help, because we end up breaking things into small units, working on them, and hope that they come together in the game at the weekend. So how can I create a small game, for example, a small 7-a-side game or a small drill where the receiver and quarterback can work on something, and I can improve for example, their anaerobic ability. Well, I can do that by just reducing the rest period between reps. If I want to increase speed, I make them work a little bit further, a little bit more distance. That's really what I'm trying to do. And, I would see it time and time again. Your physical players become faster, bigger, stronger, but their skill or their tactical ability just doesn't improve. So that was the question. That's where the question started, and the end result were, identifying the fact that the 4 coactives can't be isolated. And the best example for for anybody listening is psychology. Very often, your best psychologist is your strength coach, because he's the guy that you see most often. If he's in a good mood, he's going to lift you up that, when you go to train. If he's in a bad mood or he's moody or, whatever, the wife has run off with the postman, well, that's not going to help you when you go into, to the gym. So everybody is a psychologist. Everybody's a psychologist. You stop for coffee this morning and, the girl or the guy behind the counter's in a good mood, that rubs off on you. So psychology is the best example. You cannot do anything with anybody without there being a psychological input or psychological aspect to it. So you can't ignore these things. That's the reality of them. You cannot actually ignore the fact that these things are going to influence your periodization. So that's where I prefer to use the idea of programming. And the last point is that, particularly in team sport, things change so quickly. Your plan's not worth the paper it's written on. We plan here at Michigan, and the head coach and I, he's the best planner programmer I've come across. Without there's nobody is as detailed as he is. But at the top of the sheet is written subject to change, because it will change. Sometimes from leaving his office to making it down to the training field, the plan has changed. But that's the real world, and that's the chaos that we live in.
What's the relationship like with the strength coach? Because I can imagine that there are specific individuals, you've alluded to this, that are going to be very gung-ho about, well, no, what he really needs is he needs to get stronger. What he really needs is this, this work or that work. How does the balancing of those different pulls work? Because again, there's only so much adaptation you can get in the body. Everything is cumulative. All the stress is cumulative, and we want to be fresh on game day. And yet, there may be some kids with some very real needs. When they break physically, they're not worth anything to the team, or they are, but not on game day.
No, and you put your finger on the key point. It's game day. So, and this is where the phrase that I've used throughout the book is work backwards from the scoreboard, work backwards from the game. So the strength coaches do watch the game, while it's happening, so, but in some cases they're, focused on other things. But post-game, rarely do strength coaches watch the game, because they're busy doing recovery, they're busy getting guys ready for the next day. But the key is getting the strength coaches, the position coaches, the head coach, the medical team around the table to watch the game together. Because then the discussion happens together as opposed to separately, where the strength coach says, yeah, that's really strength. But the position coach is going, no, that's leverage, it's technique. Now, actually, sorry, it usually happens the other way around. The strength coach goes, that's technique, and the position coach goes, but sure. No, but if you do get people around the room, then the conversation, around the table, then the conversation, the key benefit is that, first of all, we use the same terms. So speed and quickness are, two different things. Quickness is, how fast he can react. Speed is how fast he moves. They're two completely different things. But if that conversation, or whatever language you want to use, if that conversation can happen around the table between the departments, now everybody knows, everybody is using the same language, the same terminology, but also what's happening is that we're identifying the limiting factor. So what is the problem that is limiting the other elements from improving? And you really only can solve those or answer those questions when you get, everybody around the table. And it ties in with, what I speak about at the back of the book, where you must have, on the coaching perspective, you must have real brutal honesty if you want to solve these problems. Where there can't be insecurity, where strength coach, position coach can say things comfortably in a room. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about just figuring out how do we solve this, because at the end of the day, there aren't lives on the line, but at the end of the day, this is about fixing a problem and fixing it fast.
How do those board meetings go? So you've been involved in a whole bunch of different professional level sports franchises, and do you walk in the room with this holistic theory, everybody needs to be on the same page? Do you get a lot of pushback? Has there been sort of weeping and gnashing of teeth behind closed doors between members of the coaching staff?
It's like with most things, you never go in straight away trying to address that problem. You go in to and sit around with people trying to find out what can I do for you, as opposed to trying to identify, maybe trying to ask people to look at their own weaknesses. It's a case of, well, this is what I think I need to work on. Is there anything else that we can do to help you guys, or what do you think it is? People always want to talk about themselves, or always want to talk about, very few people go out in the world trying to help other people for that day. So if somebody is coming trying to help coaches solve problems, for the most part, they're open to it. And, it all does come from the head guy down. In any team, it doesn't matter where it is. The head coach determines the mood, determines the attitude. And, the great thing in this instance here is, with Coach Harbaugh, it is just about winning games. So there, ego and insecurity and all of that doesn't even get a chance. It's, how do we solve the problem? How do we get it done? And I'm not particularly interested in whether you're offended or not. We have to solve this problem, and that is what coaches do, really. What good coaches do at the end of the day is, solve problems in this specific area. What's the problem? Let's get the answer, fix it, and move on.
One of the really important points that I think that you've made in this book, repeatedly throughout the book, is that it's about taking care of the player as a human being, as much as it is developing them in the weight room or on the court or on the field. You start with, the game is more than statistics, and so if the game is more than statistics, then the players are more than statistical generators. How does that, talk about how that shapes sort of everything else you do with the team? If you start looking at the players as human beings rather than their positions, what changes in terms of preparation, or even in the game?
You put that more eloquently than I did in the book. Hey, that's a crazy idea, isn't it? That athletes are human beings.
Right.
Where that came from, in my experience, was that again, what you'll find is that almost everything that you've asked me has come from something that, problem I've had to solve in sport, and this came about because we would have guys in soccer or in rugby who would fail at that moment in time. They would fail. Something would happen in a game where they would struggle or whatever. Remember that this is an elite athlete who has done something that, or whatever, for years and years and years, and then they would start to make the most basic mistake. And the common theme eventually started to become apparent, that it wasn't anything to do with what was happening on the field, because they've done this so many times. It was, something off the field. It was something away from. It was a relationship sometimes with a coach. It was a relationship with somebody off the field. It could have been a family issue. It could have been, something as simple. Not simple, but something as troubling as a sick daughter, pregnant wife. Or it could have been something far more sinister. It could have been an underlying substance abuse issue. It could have been. So the common elements seemed very often were that this was nothing to do with the performance, because this is what this is what great athletes are good at. And Michael Jordan himself said it. When he was on the court, that was his sanctuary, to get away from everything else. So these players and performers, even at college level, in the majority of cases, almost in every single case, it's about helping young men develop as young men, solve and manage and understand and have a model for life by which they can explain these challenges. And if you look after the person, the athlete looks after himself.
Indeed. One of a really interesting example that came up in my head as I was reading certain parts of the book was Tony Parker at the end of last season blowing his quadriceps tendon, landing on a simple jump shot. It didn't look like anything until he was on the floor. And the analysis of that injury immediately after it happened, to me, was very funny, because everybody wanted to talk about, oh, he landed wrong, oh, this is what happened in the game. And no, he's a 34-year-old NBA player. He's been hurting himself playing basketball for a very long time. Let's look further back. And I don't remember who beat me to the punch. I was getting ready to write the article and somebody else already published it, but they talked about his injury history for the past several years that led up to that problem. He had achy knees this week. He was sidelined this week for an injury on the opposite leg. But there was definitely a string of unfortunate events that led up to that catastrophic injury on the court.
Sorry to interrupt. One other thing as well, that when we watch things on TV and we watch things in sport, as they happen, none of us have all of the pieces of the puzzle. You don't know. Perhaps, you don't know if he was carrying a hamstring injury into that game that contributed to his inability to land. You don't know if he's had, if he's been struggling with a back issue coming into that, or maybe he's had, his ankle taped for something, or we don't know, and we wouldn't know. So when people make judgments or come to these conclusions without all of the information, it's usually more complex. And this is, again, professional sport is entertainment. So you'll never have all of the pieces of the puzzle, but it's an excellent point.
So we've kind of touched on evaluating the game through a different prism, and the differences in preparation, the differences in how we treat players as human. We need to treat players as human beings if we expect to get the most out of them on any given Saturday or Sunday. All of this monstrous complexity comes to a point at the coach. Mm-hmm. How do you prepare coaches to look at all of this complexity and manage it?
Most of them do it. Most of them actually do it. And what I think what has happened in recent times, particularly in Europe, is that many young coaches or many coaches have become threatened by analytics, sports science, and all of these newish domains. But in reality, it's not that long ago. I think it was yesterday. I think it was yesterday, or was it Sunday? It was Vince Lombardi's anniversary. And, just when you look back at coaches like that, who not so long ago were teachers, the great Bill Walsh, all of these were usually teachers who were, the word holistic wasn't used, but that's what they were. They had their own, many of these guys did their own analytics, were their own psychologist. Spoke to the local doctor to get some nutrition ideas, and they did all of these things in some manner or fashion. So the coaches that we have today are wonderful psychologists. I work with a brilliant one here. He's one of the best I've ever come across in terms of managing people and looking after the athlete, looking after the coach. And many of them do, but there is no doubt that in recent times, some of them have, I guess, some coaches have been perhaps confused, or there's been a public perception that you need an expert for everything to be on your staff. When that's not the case, you can continually develop your own understanding of different areas, but you yourself need to be able to implement it. I've been in some locker rooms where there's hardly room for the players because of all of the experts that you have, trying to squeeze into the locker room. And the downside of that is that there isn't, as I referenced before, there's no commander's intent, or there's no cohesion, because you've got all of these voices. So you need strong leadership, you need a strong head coach who's open to understanding all of the areas, but can create a very single, focused, cohesive message for the players. And good head coaches take time. They have to be able to manage people, and they have to be able to understand what all of the other areas that they're introduced to. And that's where their backroom team is critical. Very, very important that they've got good people that they can trust. Because I've seen, on the other hand, coaches misled by gurus and complicated. We've all seen that. We've all seen that in sport.
Yeah, Shane has a really good line about overcomplicated programming in an article that comes out, I think, this morning. Talking about doing squats on a stand-up paddleboard in the middle of a river. You mentioned commander's intent. And commander's intent to me resonates very well because I spent a lot of years executing commander's intent in the Air Force. But let's talk about that concept. Let's illustrate that concept, and then talk about how it ripples down through an organization.
I think, again, to that point of overcomplicating things, and I think the industry, I think I'm only interested in winning games. Like, that is the only thing that I'm interested in, and that doesn't make me a bad person. I think it's a really important thing, but how you win games and how you lose games, that determines, and that's a reflection of you as a person. You can be I hope jackass isn't too bad a word to use on the air, but you can, in other words, you can win and win honorably. You can lose and lose with honor. That determines. It's not whether you win or lose. It's how you carry yourself after you do that. That's what determines you as a person. But the desire to, the preparation to, the striving, the straining to win is the greatest. In my opinion, that's the greatest reflection of a person. How hard are you prepared to work at anything to get it, and then how you carry yourself afterwards. And in commander's intent, that is just a clear example of, this is the objective, this is what we want to achieve. So when you get punched in the face, when you struggle, when you've been knocked over and you're struggling to identify or to figure out where your bearings are, what is my objective here? My objective is to win this game. I will do whatever it takes at this moment in time to achieve and to contribute towards that objective. And it's a wonderful way to create that cohesive message. So everything that we do in the game must align with that commander's intent. And why it's so important in team sport is, we find, and again, we've all seen this, individuals who start to chase perhaps their own individual accolades or points scored or whatever it is, their own personal objectives. But at the end of the day, this comes back to winning games and comes back to the commander's intent. What can I do at this moment in time? Last point on it is that in team sports, go back and look at our game at the weekend or look at any sport, there is chaos. It is based on chaos. This is why commander's intent is so critical. If you are out of position, if you are in a place where you should not be, if you're facing a player or who is out of position, you're not supposed to be there, what do you have to do, regardless of that, to help contribute to winning the game? At the end of the day, it's about winning the game, and that has to be front and foremost. It's not about you. It's not about your own personal goals. It's about winning the game or the commander's intent.
And it's about winning the game in the off season, right? So it doesn't just start on Saturday morning when the team gets on the bus. It starts in April, and it starts in spring camps. It starts in Shane Trotter's high school gym. How does that focus translate into the off season?
Well, going back to the periodization example, this is where if you have your overall commander's intent and you work backwards from the game, that helps you identify sub-objectives or mini-objectives that all point in one direction. So at any point in time when you're training, when you're preparing, all of the objective, whatever your objective is at that moment in time, must line up with that commander's intent. So we're working on speed of decision making. The only difference, again, coming back to periodization and the tactical periodization model or the morphocycle, is that we're going to increase all of these things 1% every week, as opposed to try and increase speed this week, increase strength in 6 weeks' time. We're going to do all of these things together. And in team sport, I think it's a far more useful way, because by doing it like this, we can see the results quicker. So let's say, for example, if we take basketball, the traditional periodized model, let's say, for example, one of our commander's intent or our objectives are that we want to play faster basketball. Well, faster basketball is not about just running, it's about fast decision making. So if I just spend 6 weeks working on speed, and then I try and spend 6 weeks working on decision making, I'm going to hope that in 12 weeks' time it all comes together. Alternatively, I can work on playing fast basketball in small-sided games or in smaller games and increase speed and decision making together over 12 weeks, as opposed to trying to break it up 6 weeks speed, 6 weeks decision making. So as I get physically faster, space closes quicker, my decision making has to improve. I keep getting faster, my decision making bit by bit gets faster together, and I'm getting better week by week. And I can reinforce those objectives, those KPIs, those key performance indicators every single week. By the time I get to the 12th week, I've got faster, decision making has improved, and those KPIs, those key performance indicators, have been drilled into the players, drilled into the coaches, so that our instinct now has been trained. And coming from the Air Force, you understand that everything is about instinct. You cannot afford to think. It's about, and that was one of the key questions I had starting out years ago, is how do I train a habit? How do I train an instinct? How can I make a player do something without even thinking? How can I make him make the right decision without even thinking? And at the elite end, I've been fortunate to, I remember sitting in a locker room after a game with Frank Gore, trying to ask him a question about how and why he made a particular cut. Frank couldn't explain it to me because he wasn't thinking. He was acting on instinct. And he would look at you and just go, well, I just knew what I had to do. So great players don't think. They have built years and years of instinct, and that's what they're playing off.
Do you find that, especially for a sport like football, there's a necessarily longer off season than other sports? Do you find that, and especially in college football, well, now there's all these rules about when Coach Harbaugh or any of the sport coaches can be present, that you have to shift the approach significantly to a more psychophysical emphasized period or recovery emphasized? I mean, how do you balance not having sport coaches present in the programming model, and how do you balance maybe an extreme need for a freshman coming in to actually get a lot stronger? He's just not ready yet. How do those kind of unique situations get balanced?
Yeah, I expect it to change in the not too distant future, because I think the NCAA and the manner in which all those restrictions are in place only reinforce the traditional periodized model, and that doesn't help. We have good coaches here at Michigan, so I'm not familiar with other programs, but where you have good coaches who actually care about the players, don't overtrain them, don't abuse players, we don't have that problem. So good coaches will look after players, so you can trust them to play football and weight train together. At this current period in time, the hourly restrictions do not help good coaches look after their players as well as they could. There needs to be education with legislation to help, to monitor that, because we do have to look after our players, and we have to, cater for all coaches. But the answer is always legislation and education, not just legislation, and rules. I don't want to speak too much to the college system, because it's unique in the fact that we have the primary objective is about these young kids' education. It's not, ironically, it's not about the sport. At the end of the day, we've got young men here who are trying to prepare for life. In the NFL, though, that's a little bit different, where it is a business. In that instance, absolutely, I would have a far shorter off season. I would have teams play every second week, and the revenue would increase exponentially, but it would force teams as well to have a far shorter off season, and it would mean that there would be more rest in between games. Players would have a better opportunity to develop, and the irony is that the shorter off season would mean that there would be, I would also have guaranteed contracts, but that's a completely different story. But you would be forced to look after your investment better, because of the shorter off season. The longer off season, going back to us as human beings, we love stability. We love that and I speak about in the book, we work on a weekly cycle. We as humans are designed to, we think week to week.
The rhythms.
The rhythm, exactly. So, if we have this nice rhythm going all of the time and we have a shorter off season, there aren't these huge variances which are incredibly stressful on the athlete. And because the games would come every 2 weeks, you can't afford to force guys particularly hard. You have to look after them more, and that's what I would do. I would split it over every second week. You have more time to recover. the off season is shorter, so it means that the teams have to look after the players a little bit more. They've got a greater responsibility to them for longer over the year. But in those sports where the off seasons tend to be shorter, there isn't the very, very stressful pre-seasons of guys cutting weight or putting on huge amounts of weight, because they don't lose it in the first place, and they reach that stability and a far greater level of stability.
And with having a slightly longer rest period too, you can hopefully mitigate a lot of those overuse and injuries. Well, your entire approach is geared towards balancing frequency, density, collision, those things, to hopefully mitigate those factors.
Absolutely, and again, I didn't say that they would play more games; they would just be spread out more over the year. So, again, it's not like baseball or basketball where the frequency of games is incredible. It's pretty brutal.
Yeah.
So every coach needs to read this book, and not just coaches of team sports, because there's a lot of individual development things that are incredibly useful concepts in the book. And I think team sports coaches should probably read it once a year, just to stay fresh and to take away some concepts that they maybe missed the first time. A quote that I pulled out from the book that needs to be on the wall in a lot of offices, professional sports franchises, and amateur. We're in danger of losing our way in pages of numbers that, when taken at face value, have little bearing on how games are contested, won, and lost. Every day on SportsCenter, in fact, right now on ESPN, they are running down the weekend of the statistics and who ran this many yards and how many points and percentages and everything else. Is that handicapping our ability to understand and excel at team sports? Our obsession with the numbers?
I do think it is a challenge. I do think that for some coaches, and I don't know if this is just an American thing. I'm not sure, and I stole this from somebody. I have no idea who it is, but probably somebody bright like Einstein or someone, who said that not everything important can be measured, and not everything that's measured is important. And and again, this comes back to my experience looking at a game and trying to figure out how the heck do we improve this team, and being really brutally honest looking at the game. And I realized that not the things that we were measuring, and in Europe and in working in rugby, working in soccer, we had far more, and have had traditionally far more investment in sports science. So we were able to measure everything from resting heart rate variability in every single morning for players, blood, urine, looking at speed, movement. But none of those, what I started to realize, if you're brutally honest about it, none of those figures were adding up to helping us identify either the best player, whether we were going to play well, whether we were going to win that weekend. The statistics did not help us. The numbers did not help us. Now, it's not that statistical analysis, sabermetrics, or these things are not useful. It's that we are just not in a position yet to measure all of the important things. That's what the key thing is. So, for example, for the most part, psychology, we don't really have a good understanding, or are not in a good position to measure that. And there is nobody out there will tell you that psychology is not important. It is, but unless you can measure those qualities or assess them, it's very difficult then. You're only looking at part of the puzzle. And I go back, I use the example, 5 blind men around an elephant. One guy has a hold of has his arms around a leg and thinks he's holding a tree trunk. Somebody else is holding onto an ear and thinks it's a tent. Somebody's pulling on a trunk or pulling. We all have parts of the puzzle, but we're not looking at the whole picture, and that's the downside of focusing too much on certain statistics unless you have them all, and that's what we're trying to do, is trying to look at the athlete as a whole.
Is psychology the weakest area in most team sports programs?
I wouldn't like. Yes, I was going to give a longer answer, but I think. I don't know that it's necessarily a case that it's the weakest. I think the physical side is so overwhelming when it comes to numbers. We can, we can measure so many physical qualities, or so many aspects, so many variables on the physical side: speed, strength, power. Even tactically and technically, we don't measure enough things, and there isn't a model. But you're absolutely right. Psychology generally is a black box or a black art, and it's not that you need to be able to measure it either. This is the important thing for those coaches at high school or at weekend warriors. You don't need to be able to measure it, so to speak, but you do need to understand something about it. And that's why I use a very simple model of spiritual, cognitive, emotional. That's the basic model that I use, a very simple model. And you can measure some of those things, but at least if you're aware of those three aspects of, so when somebody makes a psychological error on the field, is it emotional, that they're just not able to understand and comprehend their emotions? Is it cognitive, they just cannot analytically understand what's happening? Or is it spiritual, that they don't feel part of the team, don't feel... You don't need to measure it to be able to say, well, that's a good, bad, those kind of things. That's where you just need to be able to manage, or you need to be able to assess those elements.
In a large part, it's kind of, as you said before, the Lombardi, Bill Walsh, these were teachers. In a large part, it's that maybe we've gotten a little bit lost in the numbers and the need to quantify everything, and the pulling back and remembering, as you've said, that it's about the player, the person, the team as a whole, and how all these parts integrate. And sure, all these numbers are great, but if you have more numbers than you can really process and make any sense of, then that's a problem. A better idea would be to have kind of a holistic framework that allowed you to process key components and differentiate what's important and when.
Yeah, there were two examples that really hit home to me. One was with a rugby team where we had the golden metric for the rugby team coming from the analysts, the statisticians at the team, were that the key metric was ball in play. In other words, when the ball went out of play, how quickly could you get it back in? So a rugby game is 80 minutes long. How much playing time can you play? And if we kept the game up to 36 minutes, we won like 99% of our games. We won every single game pretty much once we kept because we were super fit. And if we could keep the tempo high and keep playing, we would win. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the All Blacks, the New Zealand rugby team, but we played them. We come in the next morning and we were beaten. We come in the next morning and I meet the analyst walking down the corridor, and I said, hey, by the way, what was ball and play time? 38 minutes. In other words, we had played way above our ability, and we still lost the game. But when you go back and look at the game, we were playing we were so fit, but they just beat us on tactical errors. They just gave us the ball. They just let us play the game, let us run ourselves ragged. We would make a mistake, intercept, run down, score, try. So it's not about the physical numbers. Even if you think that's your key metric, it's about how intelligently can you play the game. Barcelona, one of the great soccer teams of all time, their players will run on average a kilometer less than the opponent. Why? They'll let them run like headless chickens. They'll let them run all over the place, make them run, make a mistake, go and score. The Patriots do it. The great Bulls team has done it, time and time again. You give us everything you've got. When you make a mistake, we're going to execute, and it's going to be bloody. It's going to be brutal. But the stats do not tell the whole story. You must be able to play the game. And yes, there are always anomalies and outliers. But the truth of the matter is, winning games is not solely physical. It's not solely physical. It's the combination of tactical, technical, psychological, and physical. And at the highest level, at the end of the day, when it comes down to the Warriors and the Cavs, it might appear towards the end of a game that one team is, fast or whatever, but that's what it appears by, but it's very often not those just physical qualities alone. And that's not to take away from, the great strength and conditioning professionals and the fitness professionals. They will admit it themselves. It's the result of games is not down to just one of those areas.
Sure. Dan John is kind of a fitness legend, and he talks about the fuzziness of the training effect. For example, football. You better be training. You better be getting strong in some capacity. Although how strong is strong enough is certainly relevant, but there's no direct carryover. You can't expect I'm this strong. There's this much carryover. It's a very, very fuzzy translation.
Absolutely, and just on that point as well, if you take your A football team, and let's say you were to give them 3 days off and tell them that for the next 3 days, just do a little bit on your own. The guys who are strong, I guarantee you will go and lift weights because that's what they're good at and that's what they enjoy doing. And but the area that they're weakest on, very rarely do people go and work on that weakness. That, again, I call it the limiting factor. Do they work on their technique or do they work on whatever it is? So, again, it's being comfortable. That comes back to this humility I spoke about, where you're humble enough to acknowledge that this is a weakness of mine. I'm not too arrogant to go and work on it. I'm going to spend some time and work on this. Be brutally honest with yourself. That is, my area is actually technique. I'm pretty strong. If I can improve my technique, but that's humbling because you have to go and admit that I'm not good at this and I got to improve. But that is how you become better at anything, at any walk of life.
If you could create one rite of passage for all our team sport athletes and possibly even all our people, what would it be? I don't necessarily have rites of passage. There are things I look for in people, and one is if you're doing, this is a very, very simple one. There are, I guess, 3 things. One is if you're doing any kind of test, where does the guy fail? So, for example, a bench press or a squat, does he fail at the top or does he fail at the bottom? If the guy fails at, well, that's what you want. More often than not.
But, well, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised at the number of guys who don't want to see if they've got that one more rep. So I get to my max. Mentally, he goes, I've done it. I don't have one more. The guy who's got that toughness, he's going to see, can I got one? He's not that he's happy to fail, but he's going to see, have I got one more in me? And am I going to fail? Am I going to fail at the bottom? I just want to try. I just want to see, can I got one more? The other one that I always look for is how do your players treat the cleaning staff or the equipment guys? 9 times out of 10 as well, if I want to find out something about a kid, I ask the facilities guy or the equipment guy. Don't ask the head coach. Don't ask the position coach. They're going to tell you what you want to hear. Ask the equipment guy. Does he come get a lot of gear? Does he look for this? Does he lose stuff? How does he treat your guys? And the last one is a very, very simple one. It's one I try and do is never walk past a piece of litter. It was something I learned from one of the special forces groups. But on day-to-day life, to be great or to be good, you cannot assume that you're better than anybody else. You must always remember where you are, where you come from. You're not above walking past a piece of litter. You're not, or a piece of trash, picking up, putting in the bin. You do the same as everybody else, but you cannot, consider yourself different. So it's just a small thing that that with some teams that they've tried to introduce or implement. It's a reminder that happens anywhere. You could be walking down the street, walking through walking on a corridor, and it's just a reminder that you're going to do the same as everybody else, but there's just a reminder you got to do a little bit. You got to be a little bit different if you want to be great.
It's almost as if greatness in any endeavor is rooted in character. Weird. It's not your 40 time. It's how you conduct yourself in life. The last question, and then we'll let everybody go, is if they knocked down Mount Rushmore and they came to you, Dr. Connelly, and said, Dr. Connelly, we need 4 more faces for Mount Rushmore. Who are the 4 heads that you put on the mountain for team performance, sports development, or anything else that you find important?
Oh, wow, great question. I think on a personal level, Charlie Francis was a huge influence on me. He simply just his way of thinking. He was a fabulous guy. John Boyd, I think, would go up there. Leonardo da Vinci, just purely because of his ability to draw on science to produce wonderful pieces of art. And I think that's what we do on a day-to-day basis. And a fourth one, wow. I think I'm going to have to leave that. I'm going to have to stop at 3.
We'll be short one. We'll keep one head open in case we want to put Dr. Connolly's face on it later.
Am I supposed to say Jim Harbaugh?
No, you're not allowed to say Jim Harbaugh. No, that's against the rules. Dr. Connolly, thank you so much for your time this morning. This has been hugely illustrative and very informative, and the book I'm going to be reading over and over again, I have a feeling, for years and years. The book is called Game Changer. It hits today. Of course, the podcast isn't going to come out for a couple more days. It's all over Amazon. It's already the #1 bestseller in sports health and safety, which I think is pretty impressive for 7 o'clock in the morning on debut day. Where can people find your work elsewhere, and where are you headed from here?
Well, I'm on Twitter daily at the minute, and one point on that. Anybody who emails me, I always try and answer. I do always try and answer, because great people like Charlie Francis and others, have always helped me in my career. So anytime that I can, I would always try and help people, because we have to give something back to the industry. Where am I from here? Well, we'll see after I get finished. My contract finishes at Michigan this year, so we'll see where we go. If we win, everything will be good. But yeah, we'll see where we go. Maybe write Game Changer 2.
There you go. Well, I'm voting for you for commissioner of the NFL. I want double football.
Guys, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Awesome.